Hi, everyone. Just going to go over a few points regarding the topic that we're covering throughout this semester, political science. Haven't really talked about that much. So that subject, of course, is covered throughout this text, but especially in the first chapter. And we branch off, and of course, we focus on American government. But I think it's worthwhile for us to consider the subject political science and what political science studies. So you're in Political Science 1113, and that focuses on American government. But there's several subjects, of course, that political science would cover. But as your text mentions, what all subjects that are covered by political science are based upon is the study of power. You can see that in the second bullet point there. Now, some people don't have a problem with studying power. Others might be a little uncomfortable about that. The idea that there is power that may control other people. I'm obviously pretty comfortable with covering this subject. And I really kind of look through the lens of a power relationship in almost everything that I see. And I don't really have a problem with that. You can see the definition there of power on page 9 in your text. The definition of power, page 9 in your text, is influence over a government's leadership, organization, or policies. So throughout this semester, we'll be looking at the organizations or individuals that have that power, that influence the government. So I would imagine for many of you, there are several organizations or individuals that come to mind. Obviously, the president, members of Congress, governors of states, leaders of interest groups, political parties, the media. But it can be anyone, really, and it can be a collection of people that can have that influence. But we can also look at this subject beyond just influence over government and think of power in considering any kind of relationship in which one individual or group can have influence over other individuals. I think that's an important way of considering that term power, that it's more than just influence over government, because you're just, in a sense, looking at influence in all ways. So, for instance, where do you have power? You may think you don't really have power, but when you really stop and think about it, of course you do. You have power as a consumer. You can decide not to spend money. You can decide not to spend money on certain things. You have power as a student. You may feel that you don't, but of course you do. All of you as students, if you decide not to attend class, there's really not much we can do. We as members of the institution. So people do have power. The big question is, how do you want to exert that power, and can you be unified in a way of doing that? Most people, in most situations, can't really do that, or are not willing to make that risk. So that's another issue to consider. For many people, if they want to exert power, and if they're wanting to exert power in a certain way against other people, they may consider, what if this doesn't work? Clearly, we can see that in relationships with the military or the police. And you may say it's just simply not worth it, even if you may not like the direction that one of those institutions may be going. But clearly, people have power. You have power. I have power. Anyone that we're around would have some sort of power. And so we have these power relationships, how we work with one another. And governments appear powerful. I think we could all agree upon that. My goodness, we see the police with the guns. We see the military with guns. We have all kinds of laws. We have prisons to put people in those buildings when they're not obeying the law. But it is worthwhile to consider that governments are very vulnerable. And again, they're vulnerable when people no longer view that they should have power. And a very powerful government at that point can collapse pretty quickly. Almost like seeing some really powerful animal, like looking at a horse that looks like it can withstand almost anything, and then all of a sudden it just collapses. And governments can be like that. The Soviet Union, a very powerful government, roughly survived 70 years. It didn't appear to be weak, but all of a sudden it collapsed. And so that's worthwhile to consider that, even as we can see that our own government appears to be very powerful. Could there be a situation in which it could collapse? Well, clearly, if governments have to rely upon force to get people to obey, that's not a good sign for that government. Just look at it on a very small level, or kind of a low level, I guess, in the overall power relationships. If an individual police officer, in order to get people to obey, had to, for every person that that police officer dealt with, shoot out the tires of a car to get them to stop, tase someone to get them to just obey what they're wanting to do, that police officer has really lost control. They can't continue to rely upon force. There has to be something else. And that something else is legitimacy. For all governments, for them to really survive, it must be viewed, the governments must be viewed as legitimate. Enough people must find the government deserves to have the power that it has and will follow what the government does. So once that legitimacy goes away for enough people, the government will collapse. And of course, the concern is, are there people who actually want that? They want the government to collapse. Or is there enough people that say whatever weaknesses there may be with the government, we still want it to survive? So that's the subject that we're covering throughout this semester. What's grounded in all parts of the subject that we'll cover, American government, is power. And to consider that that is actually a very fleeting source of influence. It can go away. And with it, so can the government as well. All right, we'll stop there and consider that as you continue to look over this text and the material that we're covering here on American government.